I never finished my novel. Then, its main character showed up at my apartment. 5 years ago, I wrote a fantasy novel. It never became popular, but I loved every character I created, especially the main character. Late at night, someone knocked on my apartment door. At first, I thought it was just some hooligans in the building playing a prank. But the knocking didn't stop. It kept coming, steady and persistent, until irritation finally got the better of me. I opened the door and froze. I was staring at the exact same face I had spent years imagining. He looked at me as though he already knew me. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "You finally opened the door." I just stood there, unable to move while staring at his face with my mouth open. My brain kept trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe I'd seen him somewhere before in a commercial on TV. Or maybe someone was just playing a prank. But none of those made sense because I knew that face. Zach Cromwell, the main character. Every detail was exactly the way I'd imagined creating him years ago. The messy black hair that never stayed in place, the small scar just beneath his left eye. Even the silver ring he always wore on his right hand. A detail I never even mentioned in my story. It only existed in my sketches. He sighed when I didn't say anything. "I guess this is more shocking for you than it is for me." A chill ran down my spine. It was finally sinking in. This was real. And it was completely, impossibly weird. I took a step backward and grabbed my phone from the table without taking my eyes off him. I wasn't sure whether I was about to call the police or an ambulance for myself. "I don't understand," I said. "You're not real." He laughed. It wasn't an evil laugh. It was the kind of laugh someone makes when they've heard the same ridiculous joke too many times. "I wasn't," he said, "until yesterday." He stepped forward, crossing the threshold into my apartment, then quietly closed the door behind him. Before I could react, he walked over to the sofa and sat down as though he belonged there, as though this had always been his home. I tightened my grip on my phone, ready to call the police if he tried anything funny. "You stopped writing after chapter 37, he said quietly. My stomach dropped. He was right. I had abandoned that story years ago, without so much as a proper ending. He met my eyes. There was something in his expression that made my chest tighten. His eyes were filled with pain and sorrow. Our world stopped that day. For the first time since opening the door, I felt something far worse than fear. Guilt. I stared at him for what felt like forever. "So," I swallowed. "You want me to finish the story?" He nodded, looking at me as though the answer were obvious. I let out a nervous laugh. "You know I wrote that almost 5 years ago, right? I barely even remember what I was planning." "I remember. I've lived every page you wrote." His voice became even smaller. The words hit harder than I expected. Because to me, they were just chapters on a screen. Fiction I had written late at night, and eventually abandoned. But to him, they were memories. The next morning, I found him sleeping peacefully on the couch. What happened last night hadn't been a dream. A character from my novel had somehow come to life and was now sleeping on my couch, asking me to finish the story I had abandoned years ago. Unfortunately, writing again wasn't easy. It felt like trying to pick up a conversation I had abandoned halfway through and somehow expecting to remember what I wanted to say. I went back to my bedroom, grabbed my laptop, and opened the old document where I had written the novel. I stared at the screen for hours. The blinking cursor felt like it was judging me. "It's been years," I muttered. "I don't know where the story is supposed to go anymore." "What was the last thing you wanted us to do?" I almost jumped. He had suddenly appeared beside me, close enough that I could feel his breath against my cheek. My face immediately grew warm. I quickly averted my gaze, pretending to be more interested in my laptop than in the fact that the fictional character I had spent years imagining was now standing practically shoulder to shoulder with me. I cleared my throat and tried to focus. Let me see. I scrolled through my old notes. Half of them didn't even make sense anymore. This one says, "Find the crystal beneath the silent lake." He smiled and said, "I remember that place. The water in the lake never moved." he said, and began describing it. He described the trees, the sound of the wind, and the people in the nearby village. The way the lake reflected stars even during the day. None of those details were in my notes. I never wrote any of that. I whispered. He smiled. You imagine this world, but I was the one who lived in it. For the next 2 hours, he became the storyteller, and I became the one listening. And somewhere between those stories, my fingers found the keyboard again. For the first time in years, the story started moving again, one chapter at a time. Days slowly turned into weeks. He stayed in my apartment because, as far as we could tell, there was nowhere else he could go. Explaining to anyone that this strange man living in my apartment was actually a fictional character I had written 5 years ago wasn't exactly an option. At first, having him around was awkward. We had to figure out the little things, like who was responsible for washing the dishes, who got to use the bathroom first in the morning, and how much space 2 people could reasonably occupy in a small apartment. Then there were the things I had never considered. He had no idea how a microwave worked. The first time I found him staring suspiciously at one, he had already unplugged it and moved several feet away from the kitchen counter, apparently convinced that I had brought some kind of magical metal box into the apartment. The robot vacuum was worse. One afternoon, I heard a loud thud followed by a string of startled curses from the living room. I rushed out and found him standing on the sofa, staring down at the vacuum as it calmly rolled across the floor. He looked genuinely terrified. Apparently, he had been convinced that it was alive. When I explained that it was simply a robot programmed to clean the floor, he remained unconvinced. He pointed accusingly at the machine, insisting that it had attacked his foot. From then on, I noticed that he would quietly leave the room whenever he heard its familiar mechanical hum. The man who had faced monsters, survived battles, and apparently lived through every page of a fantasy novel was genuinely afraid of a small round vacuum cleaner. I never told him how funny I found that. Next, the first place I took him outside was a convenience store. He spent nearly 10 minutes staring at the refrigerator full of drinks, completely overwhelmed by the sheer number of choices. Later, I bought him his first ice cream. He took one careful bite and stared at it in complete disbelief, as though I had just handed him some kind of forbidden treasure. It's just vanilla, I reminded him. He looked at the melting ice cream in his hand. If something this delicious exists, why do people complain so much? I laughed so hard that people around us started staring. For someone who had supposedly lived in a fantasy world, Zach was surprisingly easy to impress. And, somehow, I found myself enjoying showing him everything. Winter finally came. By then, the apartment had slowly stopped feeling like mine. It had become ours. 2 mugs sat beside the sink. 2 toothbrushes rested by the mirror. His books had found their way onto my shelves, mixed between the ones I had owned for years. His jacket hung beside my coat, and his shoes sat beside mine near the front door. Even the crooked bookshelf in the corner had become part of the apartment. He had spent hours assembling it, only to leave it leaning slightly to one side. I never fixed it. It reminded me that he had been there. There were little traces of him everywhere. At some point, I realized I couldn't remember what the apartment had looked like before he came. It was strange, as if he had always lived there, as if there had never been a version of my life without him. And maybe that was why what happened next frightened me so much. It happened one ordinary morning. Zach was reaching for his coffee when I reached for mine at the same time. Our hands crossed for barely a second, and my fingers passed through his. Not slipped past nor missed, but passed through. For the briefest moment, there was nothing where his hand should have been. Then, just as quickly, he was solid again. I froze. He looked down at his hand, then at me. I forced a smile and brushed it off as nothing. But the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Because for the first time since he appeared at my door, I was reminded that he might not belong in my world. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrifying question began to form. What would happen if he started disappearing? One afternoon, I came home exhausted from work. I dropped my bag near the door and sighed. I'm home. No answer. The apartment was unusually quiet. For a moment, my heart stopped. I checked the living room, then the kitchen, then the balcony. Nothing. Then I heard it, a soft, familiar humming coming from my bedroom. I followed the sound and found Zach asleep in the chair beside my desk, an open notebook resting on his lap. He must have been reading while waiting for me. I stood there for a while, just watching him. He looked peaceful, real. Sometimes I still found myself needing to remind myself that he was both. Without thinking, I walked over and gently brushed a strand of hair away from his face. His eyes slowly opened. "You're home." I nodded and smiled. He noticed how tired I looked almost immediately. Before I could say anything, he got up and headed toward the kitchen. He had made dinner. It wasn't anything fancy, but the sight of a warm meal waiting for me made something inside my chest soften. "You didn't have to," I told him. "I wanted to." He said it so simply that I had nothing to argue with. Later, we washed the dishes together. It had become another small routine, one of those ordinary things I never expected to share with him. Halfway through, he casually mentioned that a cashier had mistaken us for a couple on a date. I nearly dropped the plate in my hands. Apparently, he had asked what a date meant. The explanation seemed to leave him more confused than before. He began listing the things we already did together: eating, going places, learning about each other, making each other smile. I couldn't think of a convincing argument against him. Eventually, he asked if that meant we'd been dating all along. I had no answer. He seemed perfectly satisfied with my silence. I spent the rest of the evening avoiding his eyes. Later, I sat at my desk and stared at the unfinished chapter on my laptop. Nothing came. The cursor blinked patiently while I tried to force the next sentence out of myself. Zach noticed. He pulled the chair beside mine and sat down. Our shoulders touched, but neither of us moved away. He reached for my hand and rested it gently against the keyboard. "Close your eyes." I did. He began guiding me through the village. The river, the old bridge that squeaked whenever someone crossed it, the bakery that always smelled of fresh bread, the children running through the streets, and the old woman who fed the birds every morning. One forgotten detail led to another. Slowly, the world returned. Not as words on a screen, but as people and places that suddenly felt alive again. When I opened my eyes, I found myself looking at him instead of the laptop. He was still holding my hand. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I realized then that he wasn't simply helping me remember my story. He was giving me back a world I had forgotten how to love. And perhaps that was why his presence no longer felt strange. Somewhere between the late-night writing, shared meals, quiet mornings, and countless ordinary moments, he had stopped feeling like someone who had entered my life. He had simply become part of it. And when he looked around the apartment that night, his expression carrying the faintest trace of longing, I understood that he missed his world. But I also realized something that frightened me a little. If he ever had to leave, I would miss him too. As the weeks went by, writing became part of our evenings. Dinner. Writing. That was our routine. I would sit at my desk with my laptop open while Zach paced around the room, searching through his memories for pieces of the world I had forgotten. Every now and then, he'd remember something. I wrote everything down. The soft clicking of the keyboard became a familiar sound in our apartment, almost as comforting as the rain against the windows. Until one night, it stopped. I had reached the end of another chapter. Without thinking, I looked at the page count. 11. Just a number. But somehow, it felt heavier than anything I had written. 11 blank pages remained. I closed the laptop before Zach could see my grim expression. He noticed anyway. I told him I was tired, and he didn't press me. That night, after he fell asleep, I opened the manuscript again. 11. I stared at the number until my eyes hurt. A few days later, I found Zach standing in front of the manuscript while I was making coffee. He wasn't reading it. He was simply staring at the cover. He has been quieter lately. When I asked what was wrong, he told me he had been having strange dreams. Someone was calling his name. He couldn't remember the voice. It changed every time, sometimes sounding familiar, sometimes like a stranger. But the words were always the same. The ending is waiting. A cold shiver ran through me. I wanted to ask more, but Zach had already turned toward the window, his expression distant. That evening, I waited until he fell asleep before opening the manuscript again. I wanted to check something. The document looked exactly as I had left it. Then I reached the final page. There was a sentence there which I hadn't written. There was no blinking cursor, no revision history, no indication that anyone had touched the document. Just a single line sitting beneath the last paragraph. Every ending asks for something in return. I stared at it for a long time. Then, without waking Zach, I closed the laptop. For the first time since he appeared at my door, I found myself wishing the story would stop writing itself. That night, we sat on the apartment floor with empty plates scattered around us. Some movie played quietly in the background, but neither of us was paying attention. He eventually told me that he had noticed something about my world, that the happier people became, the more afraid they seemed of losing what they had. I didn't know how to answer him, because he was right. And because I was beginning to understand that I was afraid of the same thing. The next morning, I went to the public library. I wasn't expecting to find anything. I simply needed somewhere to look after running out of ideas and realizing that I was terrified of what the ending might bring. The librarian was an elderly woman who had apparently worked there for most of her life. When I awkwardly explained that I was looking for books about fictional worlds becoming real, she gave me a strange look but didn't laugh. Instead, she disappeared into the archives. When she returned, she was carrying a thin leather journal. There was no title or author's name, only a single feather burned into the cover. I opened it carefully. Most of the handwritten notes inside were impossible to understand, filled with references to stories, worlds, and something called the bridge. Then one paragraph stopped me. When a story crosses into its creator's world, it borrows time. The bridge between worlds exists only while the tale remains unfinished. However, a bridge cannot remain open forever. Stories left unfinished eventually forget themselves. I read it again and again. My hands began to tremble. I kept turning pages, desperately searching for something that would tell me there was another way. Near the bottom of one page, someone had written a question in hurried handwriting. Can the ending be changed? Beneath it was an answer written in a different hand. Never by force, nor for the price of love. That was all. I don't remember much about leaving the library. I barely remember the drive home. I only remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my hands hurt. When I finally opened the apartment door, Zach was standing in the kitchen. He smiled when he saw me. He had made tea. "You're late," he said. It was such a normal thing to say. And somehow, it broke my heart, because suddenly, all I could think about were the things I had never paid attention before. How many more cups of tea? How many more mornings? How many more ordinary Tuesdays? Zach noticed something was wrong. I forced myself to smile and told him I was only tired. He studied my face for a long moment. Then he smiled too. Neither of us said anything else, but we both knew something had changed. I eventually stopped writing. Not completely. I still opened the manuscript every night. I still read through the old chapters, still stared at the blinking cursor, still kept the laptop within reach. Just enough to keep the manuscript from moving forward toward the ending. If one page meant one step closer to goodbye, then I'd stop walking. Simple. At least, that's what I told myself. 3 days passed. Then 4. The apartment began to feel different during those days. The silence between us stretched longer. The evenings that once felt comfortable became filled with an unspoken question neither of us dared to ask. On the 5th morning, I found Zach standing on the balcony. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the buildings in pale gold. He stood with his hands resting against the railing, staring at the horizon. He always watched the sunrise, but something about him looked different that morning. The dark circles beneath his eyes hadn't been there before. His shoulders seemed heavier. Even from behind, he somehow looked smaller, almost fragile, as though a strong enough wind might carry him away. I asked him if he slept, and he responded that he did. I knew he was lying. He didn't look back at me. Instead, He kept watching the sun climb slowly above the buildings. I wanted to tell him that everything would be fine, but I couldn't bring myself to make a promise I wasn't sure I could keep. That evening, something small happened. Zach dropped a glass while putting away the dishes. It slipped from his fingers and shattered against the kitchen floor. I rushed toward him, more frightened by his expression than the broken glass. He was staring at his hands, looking confused, and said, "I thought I was holding it." He couldn't understand how the glass had fallen. Then I saw it. For less than a second, the kitchen tiles were visible through his fingers. His hand became transparent, thin enough that I could see the floor beyond it. Then, just as quickly, it returned to normal. The glass remained scattered across the floor between us. Neither of us said what we had seen. There was no need. The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable silence we had grown used to. It was the kind that comes when two people are afraid to say something out loud, because saying it would make it real. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept opening and closing the manuscript, hoping that somehow something would have changed. It hadn't. The same unfinished chapter stared back at me. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blinking cursor, until an idea suddenly occurred to me. What if I didn't have to finish the story the way I originally planned? What if I could change the ending? My hands moved before I could overthink it. I started typing. After defeating his final enemy, Zach Cromwell discovered a portal that led to another world called Earth. If the story could bring him into my world, perhaps I could write a way for him to stay. Before I could click save, the sentence suddenly disappeared. I froze. I typed it again, changing the wording. Zach chose to remain in the human world, leaving his old life behind. The words disappeared again. I tried a third time, then a fourth. Every attempt met the same result. The story refused to accept it. I stared at the empty screen, my fingers trembling above the keyboard. It was as if something beyond the story itself was correcting me. As if the universe had rules. Rules that wouldn't allow two worlds to remain connected forever. A cold realization settled over me. Maybe there really was no way to keep him here. Maybe the story had already decided what would happen. But if I followed the story toward the ending I had originally planned, Zach would return to his world. But if I stopped writing again, he would fade. Not just from my world, but from his own as well, until there was nothing left of him in either world. My eyes burned as I stared at the blank space, waiting for the next sentence. For weeks, I had convinced myself that refusing to finish the story was protecting him. Now I understood how wrong I had been. I wasn't stopping the ending. I was only delaying it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could finish the story and lose him, or I could refuse to write and watch him disappear. Neither choice would save him. And that was the part I couldn't accept. The next day at night, we walked to the nearby park. Neither of us suggested it. We simply left the apartment and walked. The park was still alive despite the late hour. Children ran across the grass, couples sat close together on benches, and dogs chased tennis balls beneath the streetlights. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and summer grass. Zach took everything in quietly. He watched a group of children run past us, their laughter echoing through the park. We eventually settled beneath an old tree, its branches stretching wide above us. I wondered how many people had sat beneath it before us, how many secrets had been whispered beneath its shade, how many people had fallen in love there without ever realizing it. For a while, we simply watched the world move around us. Children ran across the grass, their laughter rising and falling with the evening breeze. Couples occupied the benches scattered beneath the trees, some talking quietly, others sitting in comfortable silence. Somewhere behind us, a dog barked excitedly at a passing bicycle, while the distant melody of an ice cream truck drifted lazily through the streets. Everything was ordinary. Maybe that was why Zach's question caught me so completely off guard. He wondered aloud what made someone real. I leaned my head against the old tree and thought about it. I had spent years creating fictional people, giving them names and histories, fears and dreams, yet I had never really stopped to consider what separated a character from a person. In the end, I could only offer him the answer that felt true to me. Perhaps being real had never been about where someone came from, or whether they were made of flesh and blood. Perhaps it was something simpler than that. Perhaps existence could survive in the memories people left behind, in the hearts of those who had known them, loved them, and refused to let them disappear completely. Zach lowered his gaze to his hands. For a moment, I could see the question he didn't ask. What happened if no one remembered? I told him that even then, perhaps the fact that someone had once existed was enough. As long as there was someone who carried their memory, even quietly, they could never become nothing. He was silent after that. A breeze slipped through the branches above us, stirring the leaves and sending a few loose ones drifting toward the ground. Then Zach reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small piece of folded paper, worn soft at the edges from years of being carried and unfolded. He placed it carefully in my hands. I opened it. My breath caught. It was one of my old character sketches. The first drawing I'd ever made of him. I stared at the face I'd drawn so many years ago. The proportions were awful. His hair was ridiculously messy, his jaw uneven, and one eye was slightly larger than the other. It was the kind of drawing that made me want to hide my face now. Then I noticed the date written in the corner. 16. I had been 16 years old when I drew him. I couldn't help the small, disbelieving laugh that escaped me. I looked at Zach and asked where he had found it. He didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the sketch, and there was something strangely vulnerable in his expression. When he finally explained, I understood why he had kept it. It had been the first time he had ever seen his own face. My smile disappeared. My throat tightened as I looked down at the paper again. I had forgotten this drawing existed. To me, it had been nothing more than an old sketch buried somewhere in the forgotten corners of my past. A rough attempt by a 16-year-old girl to give a face to someone who had existed only in her imagination. But Zach had carried it with him. All this time. For him, it wasn't a terrible drawing. It was proof. Proof that somewhere in the world of my imagination, he had existed long before he ever appeared at my door. Before he learned how to live in my world. Before either of us understood what he had become. He admitted, almost sheepishly, that if he ever go back to his world, he wanted someone to remember him. That was what finally broke me. The tears came before I could stop them. I wiped at my cheeks, embarrassed by how quickly I was losing control, but the tears kept coming. Without thinking, I reached for his hand. His fingers were warm beneath mine, a proof that he is a real person. The realization struck me with almost painful simplicity. I had spent so long wondering whether Zach was real. I'm holding his hand. Right here.
Right now.
I didn't need an answer anymore. He looked down at our hands, surprise flickering across his face. Then his fingers slowly curled around mine, as though he were afraid that if he moved too quickly, the moment might disappear. The park continued around us, completely unaware of what was happening beneath the old tree. Children laughed somewhere behind us. Leaves whispered overhead. The ice cream truck continued down the street, its cheerful melody sounding almost absurdly happy against the ache in my chest. Everything was painfully ordinary, and somehow that made it more precious. There was no grand moment waiting for us. No magical music. No world-changing revelation. Just an evening in a park. Just his hand around mine. Just the possibility that this ordinary moment might someday become one of the things we remembered most. Zach's fingers tightened slightly. When he finally admitted that he didn't want to leave me, his voice was so quiet that I almost missed it. There was no desperation in the confession. Only honesty. I looked at him and gave him the only certainty I could offer. I would find another ending. I didn't know how. I didn't even know if another ending was possible. But I needed him to believe that it was. A faint smile touched his face, the kind that carried a little sadness with it. He reminded me, almost fondly, of how much I'd always hated sad endings. I laughed through my tears. Of course he remembered.
Of course he knew me that well.
And then I looked at him properly. Not at Zach Cromwell. Not at the character I had created when I was 16. Just Zach. The man who had appeared at my apartment door. The man who had once stared suspiciously at a microwave as though it were an enemy he needed to defeat. The man who had nearly declared war on a robot vacuum. The man who waited for me to come home, cooked when I was too exhausted to move, and quietly filled all the empty spaces in my apartment until it stopped feeling like a place I merely lived in. Somewhere along the way, without either of us noticing, he had become part of my life. Part of home. And perhaps that was when I finally understood why his question had mattered. Being real wasn't about how someone came into existence. It was about what they became once they entered your life. I realized, with a strange mixture of sadness and warmth, that I had already fallen in love with him. I was simply late in admitting it. The realization must have shown on my face because he tilted his head, waiting. I smiled through the tears and let the truth settle between us. I had already fallen in love with him. Something softened in his expression. The sadness remained. So did the uncertainty. But beneath both was something warmer. Hope. Neither of us moved at first. Then, almost imperceptibly, we leaned toward each other. The distance disappeared slowly enough that I had every opportunity to pull away, but I didn't. Our foreheads touched first. We both closed our eyes. His breath brushed against my skin, uneven and warm. Suddenly, I became aware of everything. The warmth of his hand around mine, the faint scent of rain lingering on his jacket, the steady pressure of his forehead against mine, and the rapid beating of his heart beneath his chest. Mine wasn't doing much better. For several seconds, we simply stayed that way. Neither willing to move. Neither willing to break the moment. I whispered that I didn't know how much time we had left. His thumb moved slowly across the back of my hand, a small, reassuring gesture. He didn't try to promise me forever. Instead, he reminded me that perhaps we didn't need forever. Maybe all we could do was make whatever time we had meaningful enough that neither of us would regret it. Then he kissed me. It was gentle, almost hesitant, as though some part of him still expected me to change my mind. I leaned into him, closing the last distance between us. There were no fireworks, no sudden music, no dramatic change in the world around us. The children were still laughing. The leaves were still moving in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, the ice cream truck continued along the street. The world didn't stop for us. And somehow, that made it more beautiful. His lips were warm against mine, and for the first time, I understood the strange ache of finally holding something I had been terrified of losing before I had even realized how much I wanted it. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads remained together. Neither of us opened our eyes. For that brief moment, the future didn't matter. The ending didn't matter. There was only the two of us beneath an old tree, holding onto each other while the rest of the world continued moving around us. The apartment felt different after that night. Not awkward or embarrassing, just quieter. It was the kind of quiet that settled between two people after something important had finally been said, the kind where neither person had to wonder anymore how the other felt. Nothing had really changed. The same worn sofa sat by the window. The same dishes were stacked beside the sink. The same morning light spilled across the floor. And yet, everything felt different. He was no longer a stranger who had somehow stepped out of the pages of a story. He became a part of my life and heart. The next morning, I woke to the smell of freshly brewed tea. For a few seconds, I lay still, staring at the ceiling and wondering if the previous night had been a dream. Then I heard the faint clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug from the kitchen. I followed the smell and found him standing by the counter, holding a steaming cup. Morning sunlight spilled through the window and fell across his face, catching the messy strands of black hair that never seemed to stay in place. He glanced at me and smiled. I returned the greeting, still half asleep. He noticed, of course, that I had skipped my usual morning complaint. Apparently, I had been mumbling about needing 5 more minutes of sleep every morning that week. I didn't remember any of it.
He did.
He remembered everything. The thought made my heart beat a little faster. It was strange knowing that someone could remember things about me that even I had forgotten. We started walking home together after work. It wasn't something we planned. It simply became a habit. Sometimes, we'd stop by the convenience store and wander through the aisles longer than necessary, trying to decide what snacks to buy. Sometimes we'd share a drink while waiting for the bus, passing it back and forth without thinking about it. Other evenings, we barely spoke. We'd just walk beside each other while the city slowly quieted around us. I began noticing little things. The way he always walked on the side closest to the road. The way he slowed down whenever I fell behind. The way he sometimes looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. One evening, I noticed him deliberately walking slower than usual. It took me a moment to realize why. He didn't want the walk to end. That realization should have embarrassed me. Instead, it left a strange warmth in my chest. I found myself slowing down too. I began writing again too. At first, I told myself I was doing it because I needed to understand what was happening. Then I convinced myself I was searching for a way to keep him here. But eventually, I stopped lying to myself. I wanted to know what happened next. Not just to his world.
To us.
Still, time refused to stop. Every time I stopped writing, something about him changed. Some mornings, he looked exhausted before the day had even begun. His movements became slower, his voice quieter, and dark shadows appeared beneath his eyes. Other times, the changes were harder to ignore. I'd catch his reflection in the microwave door while he stood behind me. For a split second, everything would look normal. Then nothing. His reflection would disappear. I'd turn around immediately. He would still be standing there. And when I looked back at the glass, his reflection would be there again. He always pretended not to notice.
So did I.
Neither of us wanted to talk about it, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I was beginning to understand something terrifying. The story wasn't just keeping his world alive anymore. It was keeping him alive too. One evening, while we were folding laundry, I found myself wondering what his life would look like if he could stay. The thought slipped out before I could stop it. He seemed amused by the question at first, but then his expression softened as he seriously considered it. The answer surprised me. He said he wants to get a job in the library, earn his own money, and eventually get a bigger apartment with a balcony so that we can always watch the sunrise. There was something almost painfully ordinary about his dream. He wasn't talking about some grand adventure or the fate of his fictional world anymore.
He was talking about life.
A normal one. A life that might never happen. I watched him fold another towel and wondered if he realized how cruel that made the situation. He had finally learned how to dream beyond the pages. And I still didn't know how many pages he had left. A few days later, we returned to the bookstore near the station. He immediately disappeared into the fantasy section, as he always did. I eventually found him standing between two shelves, holding a plain notebook. He told me he wanted to try writing about my world. The idea caught me off guard. For years, I had been the one creating stories. I had spent countless nights deciding what he would say, where he would go, who he would meet, and what kind of person he would become. Now he wanted to do the same for me. I didn't know what to say to that. So I bought a notebook. That night, I found him sitting by the window with the notebook resting on his knees. He was writing carefully, occasionally pausing to stare out at the city before returning to the page. When he noticed me watching, he quickly closed the notebook. Apparently, he had learned one of my oldest habits. He didn't want anyone reading an unfinished story. I laughed when I realized it. He promised that when it was finished, he'd let me read it. I believed him. Or, at least I wanted to. A few days later, I came home to find the bookshelf leaning dangerously to one side. Apparently, he had decided to fix it while I was at work. He had made it worse. Books were scattered across the floor. One of the shelves had completely collapsed, and somehow the entire thing was now leaning in the opposite direction. I stared at the mess. He stood beside it with an expression that was far too proud of himself. "I made improvements," he proudly said. I couldn't help laughing. We spent the next few minutes arguing over whether his attempt at fixing the bookshelf counted as a disaster or abstract art before eventually giving up and sitting on the floor. Together, we put every book back where it belonged. It was such a small, simple moment. But sitting there beside him, surrounded by books and laughter, I realized how much our lives had changed. Once, he had only existed between the pages of a story. Now, he was sitting on my floor helping me put my books away. And somehow, that felt more real than anything I'd ever written. That night, I couldn't write. Not a single word. Instead, we climbed to the apartment rooftop and sat side by side, letting the cool night air wash over us. The city stretched endlessly below, a sea of lights scattered between dark buildings. Above us, the sky was unusually clear, with more stars visible than I had seen in months. After a while, he pointed upward. I followed his gaze and found a familiar pattern of stars. The Traveler. I smiled and said, "I can actually see it tonight." He remained quiet for a long time, staring at the constellation. "Until our skies meet again," he murmured. I repeated the words quietly, letting them settle somewhere inside me. It wasn't meant to be a promise. It was hope. And somehow that made it harder to hear. When we finally went back downstairs, something strange caught my attention. His notebook was open on the table. Neither of us remembered leaving it that way. I stepped closer. A single sentence had appeared across the page. "Every story is written twice." He stared at the words, just as confused as I was. I looked toward my manuscript lying beside the laptop. For some reason, I couldn't shake the feeling that the sentence wasn't referring to the story I had written years ago. It was referring to something that was happening now. And suddenly, I wasn't sure anymore who was writing whose story. The next morning, I finally opened the manuscript again. Chapter 48. Only 2 blank pages remained. I stared at them for a long time. The cursor blinked patiently at the top of the page. All I had to do was continue. Just a few more paragraphs. Maybe a few more pages. Maybe I could change the ending. Maybe I could give him the future he wanted. But my hands wouldn't move. Eventually, I closed the laptop. I couldn't write. Not today. He found me sitting on the balcony later that morning. The laptop was still closed beside me. He didn't ask why. He already knew. For a while, we simply sat together as the sunrise slowly painted the buildings orange. The city below us gradually came alive. The distant sound of traffic, voices rising from the streets, the occasional rumble of a passing bus. It was an ordinary morning. I wanted to remember it exactly as it was. After a long silence, he told me that he used to think home was a place. Then he smiled. He had been wrong. Home wasn't a building or a room. It was wherever someone was waiting for you. I looked at him and realized that, somehow, my apartment had become his home. And he had become mine. That afternoon, he finally got to visit the bookstore one last time. The owner recognized him almost immediately. He had become a familiar face there, always wandering through the fantasy section and lingering between the shelves as though he could spend an entire afternoon surrounded by stories. This time, however, he didn't browse for long. The old man disappeared behind the counter and returned carrying a small package. He handed it to him, without explanation. Inside was the blank notebook he had been writing in. Except it wasn't blank anymore. Pressed into the cover in gold lettering were the words, "For stories still waiting to be written." He stared at it for several seconds. Then his face brightened with a smile, so genuine that I had to look away. Because for just a moment, he looked like someone who had a future. That evening, he finally let me read it. His notebook. I had expected stories about the city, about the little cafes we visited, the bookstores he loved, the strange things he noticed about my world. Instead, the first page held something much simpler. Today she smiled because I burned breakfast. I turned the page. Today we argued about whether cereal counts as dinner. Another page. Today she fell asleep while writing, so I carried her to bed. She pretended not to wake up. A laugh escaped me, even as tears blurred the words. Every page was filled with moments like those.
Ordinari moments.
Tiny, forgettable pieces of a life I hadn't realized anyone had been carefully preserving. I would have forgotten them. He hadn't. On the final written page, there was only one sentence. If I ever lose this life, I hope someone remembers how happy I was. I closed the notebook and held it against my chest, unable to speak. That night, the manuscript turned to another page by itself. The paper shifted without a breeze. Slowly, almost deliberately, the manuscript revealed a chapter one had been dreading since the moment I realized where the story was leading. Chapter 49. Beneath it, the title appeared. The Last Sunrise. My breath caught. For a moment, I simply stared at the words, unable to move. Then my hands began to tremble. Not yet. I wasn't ready. I didn't think I ever could be. Zach noticed the change in my expression and walked over. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't have to. The moment his eyes fell on the page, something in his face changed. He had seen it too. The chapter. The title. The ending I had been trying not to think about. I shook my head, my fingers curling against the edge of the manuscript as though I could somehow hold the pages in place and prevent the story from moving forward. I couldn't write it. I couldn't. The thought came with such certainty that it almost felt like a physical refusal inside my chest. If I simply stopped, maybe it would stop too. Maybe the story couldn't continue without me. But somewhere beneath that desperate hope was the knowledge I had been avoiding. Zach knew it too. He stood beside me in silence, and that silence told me everything he couldn't bring himself to say. The ending was waiting. I already knew what happened. Tears slipped down my cheeks. I hated this story. I hated every beautiful moment it had given me because now every one of them felt like something being taken away. Zach looked at me with that quiet, almost unbearably gentle expression of his. There was no resentment in his eyes. No anger toward the story that had given him such a cruel fate. Only gratitude. He reached up and brushed a tear from my cheek with his thumb. And somehow, that made it worse. Because he wasn't afraid. He wasn't blaming me. He looked almost grateful for everything that had happened. For a second, I couldn't understand it. How could he possibly feel that way? Then I realized. Whatever this story had taken from him, it had also given him something.
Me.
The realization broke something inside me. But the sadness that had been weighing on my chest for so long suddenly gave way to something hotter. Anger. Real anger. It rose so quickly that I barely recognized it. I turned toward the manuscript, gripping its edges so tightly that my fingers hurt. I had created this world. I had written every chapter. I had decided who lived and who died. I had given Zach his memories, his fears, his personality, his entire history. Every part of him had begun as a thought inside my head and a few lines written across a page. And yet now, when I finally wanted to keep him, the story was telling me I couldn't. The injustice of it overwhelmed me. My voice tore through the apartment. I had created him. I had decided everything about his life. So why, after giving him everything else, was I suddenly being told that I didn't have the right to choose whether he stayed? The words echoed against the walls. Then silence swallowed them. My chest rose and fell sharply as I stood there, tears still running down my face. Zach said nothing. He simply looked at me. And somehow, his silence was kinder than any answer could have been. Then the manuscript moved. The pages fluttered violently beneath an invisible wind. I stepped back as they began turning on their own. One page. Then another. Then another. The story raced backward through everything I had written, chapters flashing past in a blur. Moments I had spent years creating disappeared almost as quickly as they had appeared, until the pages stopped. The very first chapter. The beginning. The words I had written when I was 16. I stared at the opening sentence. Every story deserves an ending. I remembered writing it. Back then, I had thought endings were simple. A final page. A final sentence. A period. Something that told the reader that the story was over. I had never understood that some stories didn't belong entirely to the person who started them. The manuscript trembled beneath my hands. Then something appeared beneath the sentence. Letters formed slowly across the page, one after another. I hadn't written them. I knew every line of my manuscript. Every word. Every mistake. These weren't mine. I stopped breathing as the sentence completed itself. But no ending belongs to one heart alone.
I stared at it.
And suddenly, everything made sense. The manuscript had never been asking me to choose. It couldn't. Because somewhere along the way, the story had stopped being mine alone. Zach was no longer simply the character I had created. He had become someone who could remember, choose, love, and fear. Someone who had held my hand beneath an old tree. Someone who had looked at a terrible drawing of his younger face and called it proof that he had existed. Someone who had made my empty apartment feel like home. Someone who had become real to me. The story had begun with my imagination, but it had grown beyond me. It belonged to both of us now. And for the first time, I understood what that meant. I wasn't the only one who could decide how it ended. The next morning, Zach asked me to come somewhere with him. The rooftop. One last place. We went before sunrise, while the city below us was still half asleep. Most of the windows remained dark, and the streets were quieter than usual, washed in the faint blue-gray light that came before dawn. We stood side by side near the edge of the rooftop, watching the horizon. For a long time, neither of us spoke. There was something different about the silence that morning. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt like waiting. Waiting for something neither of us wanted to name. Eventually, Zach broke the silence. He told me he had been thinking about something. When I looked at him, he was smiling faintly. Then he reminded me of something I had spent years avoiding. I had never actually finished creating him. A weak laugh escaped me at the absurdity of it. He was right. I had given him a beginning. I had given him a name, a face, a history, memories, fears, habits, and flaws. I had filled pages with details about who he was supposed to become. But I had never finished his story. I had abandoned the manuscript long before I reached the ending. Zach looked toward the horizon. The darkness was beginning to thin, and somewhere beyond the buildings, the first traces of gold were appearing. He rested a hand over his chest. Whatever had happened to him after that unfinished manuscript was no longer something I could take credit for. Life had given him the rest. The thought seemed to bring him peace. He looked at me as though that realization was enough. Enough for him. It wasn't enough for me. I shook my head, refusing to accept it. There had to be another way. There had to be something I hadn't thought of yet. I told him I could still find one. He stepped closer, and there was something strangely reassuring in his expression. He believed there was another way too, but not the kind I was imagining. Zach reached into his pocket and pulled out his notebook. The same notebook he had carried with him through all the small, ordinary days we'd shared. He placed it in my hands. The gesture made my stomach tighten. He asked me to read the last page. My fingers trembled as I opened it. There was only one sentence. The ink looked fresh, as though it had been written moments ago. If love is real, then no world can truly separate it. I read it twice. Then a third time. I looked up at him, searching his face for some explanation. He didn't have one. He admitted that he didn't know what it meant either. But then his gaze drifted toward the horizon, and something about the way he watched the approaching sunrise made me wonder if perhaps the words hadn't been meant to be understood yet. Maybe the story had written them for us. Maybe, somehow, the story knew something we didn't. As if summoned by the thought, the first ray of sunlight broke over the horizon. It touched the rooftop in a thin line of gold. A warm breeze swept past us. The pages of the notebook lifted. I froze. Across from us, the manuscript I'd brought with me opened at the same time. Neither of us touched either book. The pages began turning on their own. Then the words changed. On Zach's notebook, new ink appeared beneath the sentence. Every story is written twice. I stared at it. A moment later, my manuscript answered, once by the author. Then another sentence appeared in his notebook, once by the people who live it. The wind suddenly stopped. The city seemed to hold its breath. Even the sounds below us faded into the background until all I could hear was my own heartbeat. I looked at Zach. He was already looking at me. Something in his expression told me he understood. Whatever was happening, we had reached the end. I grabbed his hand. I couldn't let go. His fingers closed around mine, warm and familiar, and for a moment I convinced myself that holding him tightly enough might somehow keep him here. He gently squeezed my hand and asked me to look at him. I couldn't. Because I knew what I would see. I knew that if I looked at his face, I would remember it. Not the way I had imagined him at 16. Not the character sketch. Not the words I had written about him. I would remember him as he really was. The man who had stood in my kitchen while burning pancakes. The man who had fought with a robot vacuum as though it had personally offended him. The man who had wandered through bookstores with childish fascination. The man who had eaten his first vanilla ice cream cone and looked at me as though he had discovered something extraordinary. The man who had stood beside me on balconies and rooftops, watching the sunrise as if he were seeing the world for the first time. Zach smiled. He wanted me to remember him that way. So eventually, painfully, I forced myself to look. He was smiling. Not the perfect smile I had once imagined for a fictional character. His smile.
Familiar. Warm.
A little sad. But completely his. He told me he had never really been afraid of going home. I understood what he meant. Home had never been the place he came from. It had become the place he had found. He tightened his fingers around mine. And then he admitted the one thing he had been afraid of all along. Not leaving this world. Not losing his existence. But leaving mine. That was what finally broke me. The tears came freely. I couldn't stop them anymore. I told him I loved him. The words came out broken and breathless, but once they were spoken, I couldn't take them back. I loved him. More than I knew how to explain. More than seemed fair. More than a person should have been able to love someone who had once existed only on a page. Zach only smiled, as though he had known all along. And when he finally told me that he loved me too, there was no uncertainty in his voice. Only warmth. Then he leaned closer and pressed a gentle kiss against my forehead. His lips lingered there for a moment. He whispered a final promise. Until our skies meet again. The sunlight reached us. And then I felt his hand begin to change. At first, I thought it was the light. His fingers became translucent at the edges, the morning sun passing through them. I tightened my grip. But there was nothing I could do. He wasn't being pulled away.
He wasn't torn from me.
He simply began to fade. Slowly. Quietly. Like morning mist dissolving beneath the warmth of the sun. I watched his face become softer around the edges. His shoulders. His hands. Everything that made him solid and real began disappearing into the golden light. I kept holding on to him for as long as I could. One moment, he was standing in front of me, his fingers wrapped around mine. The next, I was holding nothing but warmth. And then even that disappeared. I stood there without moving. The rooftop felt impossibly large without him. The space where he had been seemed almost unreal, as though the world had simply erased a person and expected me to continue living as if nothing had happened. Below me, the city slowly came alive. Cars began moving through the streets. Windows brightened one by one. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the faint sound of a morning train. People were waking up, going to work, buying breakfast, arguing about traffic. The world continued. It didn't stop because I had lost someone. And above it all, the sun finally rose. I looked down at the notebook still resting in my hands. The final sentence remained exactly as it had been. If love is real, then no world can truly separate it. My fingers traced the words. Then I pressed the notebook against my heart and closed my eyes. For the first time, I understood. Maybe an ending didn't mean that something had disappeared. Maybe it only meant that the story could no longer continue in the world where it had begun. Some stories ended. Some crossed the boundary between worlds. And some simply changed where they lived. I opened my eyes and looked toward the sunrise. For just a moment, I could almost imagine him standing beside me again, smiling. watching the sky as though it were the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. I smiled through my tears and let the sun rise. I don't remember how long I stayed on that rooftop. Minutes.
Hours.
Time had stopped making much sense. When I finally looked down, his notebook was still there. So was mine. I picked them up with trembling hands. For a moment, I was afraid to open them. But when I finally did, I found that neither contained a single blank page anymore. Both stories were complete. I closed the notebooks and held them against my chest. For the first time since Zach disappeared, I let myself cry without trying to stop. Then eventually I went home, and life somehow continued. Not immediately, not easily, but slowly. Months passed. The sharpness of the grief softened into something quieter, the kind of ache that no longer demanded to be felt every second, but never completely disappeared either. The bookstore owner eventually offered me a small job writing children's stories on the weekends. I accepted. It felt strangely appropriate. I spent my Saturdays surrounded by picture books, stacks of paper, and children who believed without hesitation that anything was possible. Sometimes they asked me where my stories came from. I never knew how to answer that. I simply smiled and told them that stories tended to find their writers when they were ready. The apartment changed too, though some things remained exactly as they had been. The crooked bookshelf still leaned slightly to one side. I never fixed it. His hoodie still hung beside the door. I never moved it. And sometimes, without thinking, I still made 2 cups of coffee in the morning. It took me a while to realize I was doing it. The second cup would sit untouched on the table until it went cold. I never poured it down the sink. Not until noon. Some habits were difficult to teach the heart to forget. Then, one spring morning, I finally decided to publish the novel. I had spent years believing I needed to fix it first. Rewrite certain chapters. Change the ending. Make it better. But eventually, I realized that wasn't why I had been keeping it hidden. I had been afraid to let it go. So, I published it. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. There were sentences I would probably rewrite if I read them again. There were places where the story still carried the awkwardness of the 16-year-old girl who had first created it. But it was complete. And that was enough. Before the first chapter, I added one final page. It wasn't part of the story. It wasn't meant for the readers. It was simply something I needed to leave behind. One sentence. For the person who taught his author how to finish living. Then, I closed the manuscript. And, for the first time, I didn't feel like I was saying goodbye. I was simply letting the story exist. Years passed. The novel found its readers. People wrote to me about the characters. They told me which scenes made them cry, which ones made them laugh, and which lines they carried with them long after they had finished the book. Every once in a while, someone would ask where I had gotten the idea for it. I'd always smile. A dream. They would laugh.
So would I.
Because explaining the truth would take forever. And even if I tried, I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. Besides, some stories aren't meant to be proven, only remembered. Sometimes, when the sky is especially clear, I still wake before sunrise. I make 2 cups of coffee. I take them out onto the balcony and sit beneath the quiet morning sky. One cup stays beside me. The other slowly cools in my hands. And I look toward the horizon, waiting for the first light to appear. Waiting for that familiar feeling I can never quite explain. Sometimes I imagine I can see him somewhere beyond the city. A figure standing beneath another sky, watching the same sunrise. Maybe it's only memory. Maybe it's wishful thinking. Maybe it's the part of me that never learned how to stop hoping. I don't know. But I keep looking anyway, just in case. Because somewhere, in some world I may never reach, perhaps there is still a man looking toward the same sky. And perhaps, just for a moment, he is looking back. If this story touched your heart, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more stories like this. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.